I want to talk about something a bit controversial, and this doesn't come from a place of malice or hate. I just think this conversation needs to come back to reality for a second. I want to talk about Kala, the woman who is building a tunnel system underneath her suburban house. She currently has a stop work order from the local municipality. And Kala, if you're watching this, I hope you get all of the permits and inspections and stamps that you are required to have, and that you are able to complete your project in a safe way. But no matter what your background is, whether it's engineering, construction, or something completely unrelated, I feel like you should be able to recognize that Kala is not in the right here. She lives in a suburban house. She is doing a heavy engineering project that carries inherent risk with it. And whether or not she has been able to mitigate all of those risks that may or may not impact her neighbors, it eventually gets to the point where there is a public notification process. If you don't want to go through that process or the permitting or the inspections, people move to the middle of nowhere all the time so that they don't have to deal with that many permits or inspections or paperwork. But living in a suburban house, which is the whole premise of this tunneling project playlist, which I will admit I've been watching, you kind of signed up to go through the permitting process. And she said in her comments that if she was to go through permitting process, there would be so many amendments and it would take such a long time. That is what happens when you live in a suburban house. You have to go through the permitting process. That's literally what engineers do. Which brings me to my second point I want to talk about. Kala, on your YouTube page, you are marketing yourself as an engineer in your username. I am someone that has an engineering degree and has worked at engineering firms. I would never call myself an engineer, and I would never throw that word around because I'm not a licensed engineer. Now, Kala's background is in software development, and I don't mean that in a way to minimize her incredible wealth of knowledge and the impressiveness of this project, but calling yourself an engineer communicates to the audience that you have such a professional background to the point where you can be trusted as a primary source. And Kala is not a primary source. This is a DIY project with a wealth of knowledge that has been accumulated from the study of sources in her free time. That's so impressive. But she is not an engineer, not a professional engineer. And I think a lot of people were under the impression that she was or had an engineering background. And it might inspire people in her audience to do projects that they shouldn't or aren't safe or not qualified for or simply illegal. That's something that a professional engineer would have to live with. And probably is a reason why professional engineers don't broadcast things like these to audiences on the internet. Because the reality is, being a professional engineer carries a lot of liability with it, and depending on the context, carries similar liabilities to being called a doctor. And I forget who it was, but I saw someone on this app defending Kala saying that she knows the building codes better than most people that work in construction. And as someone who also worked in construction, I fully agree with them, but there's a reason for that, because most people working in construction don't need to know the codes like the back of their hand because they're not the ones that are liable for a majority of the work. That's the professional engineer. So it's not impossible for a regular person working outside of construction or engineering to go become more competent in the codes by studying them on their own, but it is impossible for them to carry the same liability as a professional engineer. And chapter 1 of the building code in like New York City, for example, is getting building permits. So again, I'm not trying to be a hater, but I think we need to bring this conversation back to reality, because when you live in the suburbs, you have to deal with the suburbs. If you want to do all of this and not have to deal with any of the paperwork, I'm sure there's a nice piece of farmland waiting somewhere in Wyoming.